Statin hesitancy. One patient's perspective. Statin hesitancy. The general concept that the cholesterol-lowering class of drugs known as statins are being systemically overprescribed in the healthy population, resulting in minimal benefits and substantial harm. The refusal to submit to statin therapy without a clear and substantial health benefit being established. A philosophy in which lifestyle adjustments are favored over lifetime statin drugs when addressing cardiovascular risk. The statin hesitancy community believes all patients have the right to clear and accurate information on the benefits and harms of statin therapy. All patients' reports of adverse effects from statins should be taken seriously by their medical providers. All patients have the right to refuse statin therapy, and that decision should be treated with respect and dignity. Refusal of statin therapy should not impact the quality of other care received from or options offered by providers. Statins are a class of lipid-lowering agents and a worldwide phenomenon. It is estimated that 40 million Americans and as many as 200 million people worldwide take statins to lower their blood cholesterol levels, with the hope that it lowers their risk of cardiovascular disease and cardiovascular events, such as heart attack and stroke. Statin proponents have recommended that they be put in the public water supply, that they be given to everyone over a certain age, that they be given to children, that they be sold over the counter like aspirin, and even suggesting that they be served as condiments at fast food restaurants to counteract the bad health effects of eating such food. Not everyone is on board with this way of thinking, however. Russ Ellsworth is a retired software engineer who operates the YouTube channel My Statin Free Life. His goal is to make statin hesitancy an accepted position among patients and providers.
What is this statin hesitancy movement about? Isn't it just fear of side effects?
Well, if you look up statin hesitancy on Google, that's exactly the definition you'll get. But I think that misses the point. Adverse effects are a concern, and they are the reason I personally stopped taking statins. But there's a broader and more important point, and that is the benefit side of the equation. If you go to your doctor and say, I'm afraid of the side effects, he'll likely tell you that, well, they're rare, and if they do occur, they're recoverable if you stop the statin, or perhaps we can treat them with a cascade of other medications. They're certainly not rare by any definition of the word that I know, and while most side effects do resolve with statin discontinuation, there's numerous cases where victims of statins did not recover fully. And that has to be part of the personal evaluation each patient makes and decides upon. There's an assumption that the benefits are substantial and that the side effects are a minor trade-off.
In data gathered from 36 trials with 200,000 participants, there were 14,000 events in the control groups and 11,600 events in the treated groups, a reduction of about 17%. But it means that out of every 7 people who, if left untreated, would have an event, a heart attack or stroke, 6 will still have that event even when taking the medication.
People are never told about the likelihood that they'll still have a cardiovascular event, so they get a false sense of security. Take this pill and you're good to go. Now, maybe many, if not most, would still take the medication if they knew this, but they'd also maybe be a little more careful with their diet and exercise regimens.
Of 99,000 patients in the control groups, 86% had no event at all. The absolute risk reduction between the control and treated groups was 2.4%, a drop from 13.9% to 11.5%. This means 42 people must be treated for the duration of these trials, usually around 5 years, to avoid one adverse event.
When put in terms of absolute risk reduction, it seems less and less attractive. Mainstream medical professionals find these figures impressive. I just don't. most patients have been convinced by their doctors that they will die of a heart attack prematurely if they don't take this pill. But if they do take it, then they will not. And that's simply not true. The benefit side of the equation for most people, and I emphasize most, it's abysmal. One problem is that in a group that meets the statin eligibility requirement of a 10-year risk, most of them won't have a heart attack, but they get treated anyway. So it gives the illusion that they have been saved from a heart attack when in reality only a small percentage of them have avoided one.
Medical journals abound with editorials with titles such as Statin Denial, an internet-driven cult with deadly consequences, and Cholesterol Denialism is Pseudoscience. The latter article conflates statin hesitancy with cholesterol denialism.
You object to the term statin denial, at least when applied to the statin hesitant. What's the difference?
Well, the problem with denial, statin denial, which statin advocates will try to pin on us, besides being inaccurate, the term brings a lot of baggage with it. It's used as a way to denigrate an opposing opinion. We have Holocaust denial, election denial, climate change denial, vaccine denial, evolution denial. And regardless of where you stand on any of these, the framing of the term denial by the opposition it's pejorative. Some positions undoubtedly deserve it, but it's a way to strip legitimacy of an opposing position. So we really do want to avoid allowing that term to be attached to this movement. We are statin hesitant. We have good reason to be, but hesitant is not absolute, whereas denial is. And the statin hesitant do not necessarily deny all cholesterol connection with heart disease. That's a position that statin hesitant people will differ on. In my case, I think cholesterol is important, but it's lipid quality rather than quantity that carries more meaning.
Is it ever proper in the minds of the statin hesitant for someone to take statin?
I think that's the beauty of the term statin hesitancy. Being hesitant does not mean never. I've even spoken with a doctor who I consider to be statin hesitant from his public statements, yet he himself takes a low dose of rosuvastatin, that's Crestor, every other day to stabilize plaque. But he doesn't prescribe Lipitor, for example, or Torvastatin, and doesn't prescribe statins based solely on an LDL number from a blood test. I think that most, if not all, doctors who would accept the term statin hesitant as their position would agree to some condition where a statin would be an appropriate treatment. But I think almost universally, primary prevention for low-risk patients wouldn't be that condition.
What was your statins experience like?
Well, I was first put on statins around age 50 at the insistence of my primary care physician, based entirely on her fear of total cholesterol over 200 milligrams per deciliter. It's about 5.2 millimoles per liter. In those days, there was no risk assessment. The pooled cohort equation calculators didn't exist yet. The Framingham calculator was available, which is now known to overestimate risk by 24 to 50%. My doctor never told me anything about my risk level or what kind of risk reduction statins might give me, and I didn't know enough to ask, and she probably couldn't have given me an accurate answer anyway. Even today, most patients and doctors don't have this conversation. I've put my numbers into today's risk calculators to see in retrospect what my risk was back then, and by today's guidelines, I was not eligible for statin therapy, yet I was made to feel like my life depended on taking statins. My 10-year risk was calculated as about 4.6%, or a 95.4% chance of not having a heart attack. Statins would have reduced that 4.6% to maybe 3.5%. So I was taking a drug that my doctor seemed convinced was most definitely a matter of life and death. But really, it was just making a tiny difference in my risk at best.
So you were in perfectly good health and you were put on this drug.
Actually, I wasn't. I look at the lipid panel and other blood tests from back then and that I have on file, and I admit to being appalled, not only at what I now see as considerable insulin resistance from a lifetime of eating a carbohydrate-rich, all-processed diet, which I call the crap diet, but my triglycerides to HDL ratio was a horrendous 7.45 when the measures are in milligrams per deciliter, which admittedly means my risk may have been even higher than that 4.6%, but the calculators don't take that into account. Statins did not improve that ratio much, certainly did not get me anywhere near a desirable one, and my doctor never talked to me about insulin resistance or lifestyle changes to improve things. I really think she was enamored of statins and she considered them wonder drugs. She was going to save the world by getting as many of her patients onto statins as she could. Insulin resistance would lead to type 2 diabetes eventually, but that was of little concern since she was certain I was destined for a heart attack first, and we could deal with the diabetes later. These things can be dealt with through lifestyle changes, but for those changes to stick, you have to understand why they're important and you have to see or feel the results. So all the signs were there in the blood test. I think they were interpreted wrong and treated wrong. Insulin resistance was and is still my biggest risk, and it was being ignored.
In 2018, various organizations released a guideline for cholesterol management. 9 out of the 10 recommendations covered different criteria for prescribing statins. Ellsworth believes that these recommendations ignore an important aspect of patient decisions: the patient's personal values.
What is it about the guidelines on cholesterol management that you find objectionable?
Well, several of the recommendations either don't make sense or contain value judgments masquerading as science. For example, why is a 7.5% 10-year risk the threshold for statin eligibility? That's not a scientifically derived threshold. It's an expert opinion from a group that is heavily influenced by big pharma. The absolute risk reduction for a 7.5% risk will only be about 1.5%. Is that enough? Well, maybe for some people, maybe it is. For me and many others, it's definitely not, especially when the cost is being on a substance, possibly for life, that interferes with your basic body chemistry. Do you trust the profit-driven industry that won't let us see their clinical trial data enough to submit to this? Another statement we hear all the time, especially when an adverse effect has just been described, is the benefits outweigh the risks. This is also simply a value judgment. It's not a very defensible one. Lower your cholesterol but increase insulin resistance? I saw an ad that stated that one statin raised blood glucose by 7% in just 12 weeks, while the statin being advertised only raised it by 2.5%. Those are astoundingly high numbers for such a short period of time. A 7% relative increase in blood glucose changes a 5.7 HbA1c to a 6.1. And even a 2.5% increase raises it to over 5.85. This same ad had that benefits outweigh the risk statement highlighted. When benefits outweigh the risks is applied to everyone, individual patients end up overlooked. Statins have been shown to increase insulin resistance in many patients, yet they are recommended for most type 2 diabetic patients. That strikes me as counterintuitive, to put it politely. Your doctor may say there are only a few cases of new onset type 2 diabetes among statin users, but that's an artificial statistic. It only considers a small percentage of patients who are close enough to the edge of diabetes, who happen to be pushed over the official threshold in terms of HbA1c. People who are pushed closer to type 2 diabetes but don't happen to go over the edge during the trial period, and people who are already clinically type 2 diabetics and are made worse, they're not accounted for in that statistic.
Why is this so important to you? You've obviously overcome the statin problem and solved it for yourself.
Well, that is a fair question. I could just shrug and say to myself, well, at least I don't have to be subjected to this anymore. But on my YouTube channel, I get a lot of comments from people who have been victimized, and that's the right word to use, victimized by statin side effects, or their family members have been. Yet their doctors deny it, gaslight them, stonewall them. Most older patients, and those are the ones who are hurt the most, are still living in the past where the doctor knew all and had this mystique about them as the expert. You never second guess the doctor. Now, most doctors are great, hardworking people who really want to help their patients, but think about the pressures they're under. A 20-minute meeting with them is an extended visit. Can they really understand your health in any comprehensive way with 2 or 3 of these meetings a year? I certainly couldn't, and I only have me to study. They may have 2,000 patients, and they're in a system that rewards efficiency, if you can call it that. And they really have to treat their patient population as just that, a population, and not unique individuals, each with unique needs. It's easy to look at a blood test and see a measure that seems to be out of alignment and prescribe a pill for it. And who decided that pill is right for the condition, or that the condition is even a problem at all? Mostly it's pharmaceutical companies and panels of experts, at least partially funded by those companies. Would you trust a used car salesman to tell you everything he knows about the car he wants to sell you, or would you bring it to an independent mechanic? That's where we are now, and we ourselves have to be the independent mechanics. Our doctors simply have too little time to be that for us. They're told, follow this guideline or be subject to all sorts of scrutiny or even loss of position. And a lot of patients want to believe that they can get health out of a pill bottle. When faced with a patient who pushes back and says, I'm not part of the system, many doctors don't know how to handle it. I think the doctors are as much victims of the current medical system as we patients are.
Assuming everyone is acting in good faith, why is there this disconnect between the statin hesitant and statin advocates?
I think there's two issues really. One is that statin advocates view the question from a population perspective. And yes, if you treat 1 million patients, of which 100,000 would have a heart attack if untreated, you may very well avoid 20,000 or more heart attacks. And that's a very large number from a public health point of view. The problem is individuals are not populations. A trade-off that makes sense in a population just might not make sense for the individual patient. 900,000 of those patients weren't going to have a heart attack, and 80,000 will have one anyway. But adverse effects don't seem to care which group the patient is in. And despite the claims by some that adverse effects only affect 2% of patients, that figure is incredibly faulty, enough that I call it what it is. It's a lie. Some sources put the figure as high as 30% of all patients. But pharmaceutical companies have no incentive to run real trials to look for adverse effects. The trials designed to study statin effectiveness often don't look for adverse effects or have a washout period where participants can drop out of the trial after a test phase in which they took the medication, or the patients in the trial all are extremely healthy to begin with. As you can imagine, many of these patients drop out because of adverse effects, and they're never counted. The second issue is one of value judgments. How is a clinician or researcher to decide for an individual patient what adverse effects should be tolerated to be offset against a small chance of avoiding a heart attack? What good is it to give up the activities that make life worthwhile for an individual on a small chance of a benefit?
Conventional cardiovascular risk calculators weigh blood pressure, insulin resistance, and smoking history as higher risk factors than lipids. Yet these calculators are used for prescribing cholesterol-lowering drugs, and they do not take a nuanced view of lipid values. Triglycerides and triglyceride to HDL ratio, Lp(a), LDL pattern, percentage of small dense LDL particles, C-reactive protein, and a host of other measures can all shed light on a comprehensive assessment of metabolic health. Yet most PCPs are ill-equipped to consider these.
Has lifestyle really changed things for you?
I look at lipid panel quality and related markers. My total cholesterol is still high by mainstream medical standards, yet the risk is low according to the latest, more accurate calculators. If I had the same values now as I did then, now with almost 20 years added to my age, I would be eligible for statins by today's standards. But now, my trigs, the HDL ratio is way down. Both these factors are somewhat volatile, but most of my blood tests show my ratio to be under 2 and sometimes under 1. My LDL fractionation is pattern A, which is a good pattern. My small, dense LDL particles make up only somewhere between 15% and 19% of all my LDL. My Lp(a) is at or below 12 nanomoles per liter, and even though many believe that value is genetically determined, it can vary with diet. In my case, it is sometimes too low to be picked up by the lab test, which means under 10 nanomoles per liter. My high sensitivity C-reactive protein ranges from 0.2 to 0.8 milligrams per liter. These are all good signs, so we have to bear in mind that these are all markers and not direct measures. My biggest concern is insulin resistance, as I've said, and I'm taking active lifestyle steps, dietary and exercise changes to reduce it and get to normal as opposed to pre-diabetic, which is where I am now. I'm on the edge of pre-diabetic and normal.
What is a good direct measure then of cardiovascular risk?
Well, the best measure is probably a carotid intima media thickness test, or CIMT, which shows whether there's plaque buildup in the carotid arteries. It's a non-invasive test, but it does take some skill on the part of the technician or doctor to do it properly. Often a patient will get what's called a carotid bruit assessment or a carotid auscultation. These are different names associated with the same procedures, which really only detects extreme blockages and can give a false sense of security to someone who has up to a 60 or 70% blockage that those tests won't detect. They're listening for turbulence, so they're listening rather than looking, I guess would be a way to put it. There are other tests that can be done, such as a coronary artery calcium score or a CAC score, which can tell how much plaque has calcified in the coronary arteries. The important thing is for patients to understand what the various test results are really telling them and not assume more than the test can provide. And I found that many doctors aren't really good at understanding what a patient is asking them about such tests, since we generally don't speak their lingo. Even a CT angiogram of your carotid arteries can miss a 30% blockage. While I was in the hospital after an episode of transient global amnesia, I asked a resident doctor if I had any blockage in my carotid arteries that could have led to this event. She told me there's a great question, and she read the lab report, no stenosis or blockage. I thought that was great, but really it turns out to only mean I had less than that 30% blockage required to show up on that test. I was 65 years old at the time, so I know I must have some blockage at least.
So these are all reasons why you stopped taking statins.
Actually, no. I was like totally unaware of any of this. The mantra of the day back then was high cholesterol is bad in and of itself and must be under 200 milligrams per deciliter. Again, about 5.2 millimoles per liter. There was a little bit of talk about HDL versus LDL, but total cholesterol seemed to be the driver. It was almost as if arterial plaque wasn't something to be measured, just cholesterol itself. What drove me away from statins was simply the adverse effects. They took years to develop in my case, and even more years for me to understand that these health and cognitive problems I was having were caused by them. They were sufficiently bad to degrade my quality of life, and even though I did my best to suck it up and live with what at the time I thought and the doctor insisted were age-related issues, they eventually started to interfere with my ability to function normally.
How so?
Well, for example, I started to make mistakes at work, leaving equipment turned on without proper safeguards in place that could have caused millions of dollars of damages and worse yet, hurt somebody. Less dangerously, one time I rewrote an entire 70-page document when I forgot I had already written and published it. I found my driving ability degraded. For example, I scraped my wife's car against a tree in the yard because I could no longer properly assess spatial orientation. It came to a head when I was out hiking in the Grand Canyon with my son. I was actually going through statin withdrawal. It's a relatively rare phenomenon, but it does occur in some people. We didn't realize it at the time, but if my son hadn't been with me, I really feel like the trip could have ended in disaster. Fortunately, he was able to guide me through the worst of it, and he kept me from accidentally falling over a cliff or something like that.
How does this experience relate to the beliefs that the statin hesitancy community shares?
Well, first, I wasn't getting clear and accurate information on the impact of statins. My doctor was seriously overestimating the benefits, whether through zealousness or ignorance, I don't know. Secondly, she wasn't taking my reports of adverse effects seriously. Most commonly, I was told statins don't cause that, even though there are plenty of studies showing that the statins do indeed cause what I was experiencing. She offered to put me on what I called the polypharmacy treadmill, drugs to treat the side effects I was getting from statins, and that would have led to more drugs to treat those side effects. When I decided to get off statins, I was roundly chastised and told to get back on them immediately because I experienced the rebound effect where temporarily my cholesterol spiked well above its normal natural level for me. I even suspected this was the case at the time, but my doctor insisted there was no such thing, even though it's a well-known phenomenon.
Your quality of life issues have resolved?
They have, mostly. As an example, when I was 50 and on statins, I couldn't hike much more than 50 miles on a single trip before my hiking companions, usually my son, recommended we stop early. I'm now 66, and over the past 4 years, I have completed 4 major solo hikes totaling over 1,500 miles. So my exercise tolerance has returned. I'm now able to work out regularly with a variety of high-intensity intervals, cardio, and resistance training. And I no longer feel like I'm in a mental fog all day. That was a big problem for me because it's so subjective and could be caused by so many things. Work stress, for example, or even a simple midlife crisis, that I was never certain at the time what was happening. And I still have some residual neuropathy in my knees, but that's really about it.
What's next for the statin hesitancy movement?
Well, I need to first catch the attention of statin hesitant doctors, those who are on record as thinking in these terms, and to get them to start using the term statin hesitant. If we can get it into common language, perhaps into published papers, for example, and can remove the stigma of going against mainstream pharma-driven medicine, maybe we can start making progress. Maybe I'm dreaming, but I think a lot more doctors would subscribe to a statin hesitant position if they could. I'd really love to see a secret survey of doctors to see how many are already there but can't admit to it publicly. Unfortunately, the average primary care physician just doesn't have the time or energy to assess their position critically, so they go with what the AMA and the ACC tell them without questioning it.
In the final analysis, The decision to take or not take statins must remain in the hands of the individual patients, not in guidelines heavily influenced by pharmaceutical companies, and not based on statistics intentionally marketed to us to convince us that the solution to our metabolic health lies in a prescription bottle.